LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Philip Comella, who joins us to discuss his book, The Collapse of Materialism, Visions of Science, Dreams of God. Can human consciousness be explained by Darwin and materialist science? Does matter exist outside of the mind, with no rationale or direction, the universe created completely by chance? Since ancient Greece, materialists have held that there is no room for purpose or design. We exist in a random and unconscious universe that has evolved through natural selection. However, a very different view of the universe and its creation has coexisted with the materialist point of view. In this version, the universe is the creation of a powerful and purposeful mind, one that exists outside of matter and is, in fact, the creator of matter. For millennia, these two opposing viewpoints have clashed, often with catastrophic results. In The Collapse of Materialism, Comella proposes a profound shift in the way that we look at the exchange of beliefs between these two domains. Envisioning the end of the mechanical scientific worldview as it is currently taught, the author believes that civilization may be at the beginning of a new epoch, a time of great spiritual awakening, with humanity transcending to a higher truth, one that unifies the now colliding cultures of science and religion. Hello and welcome, Philip, and thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
It's great being here, Greg. Thanks a lot for having me.
Philip, today we're going to talk about your new book, The Collapse of Materialism, Visions of Science, Dreams of God. Before we get into that, just tell listeners a little bit about your background and your work.
Okay, so I have a degree in philosophy, which I got from Beloit College a while ago. I also have a lawyer degree, so I am a practicing lawyer. And I'm one of those people that studied philosophy and then had to figure out a way to make a living, which is why I went to law school. And so everything has evolved from there. Now, the book itself is really a derivation of a college paper that I started, many moons ago. I think my first or second year of college, and the paper evolved into this book after about 100 rewrites and many lessons, many epiphanies. So I'm really somebody that's always had a mission to write a book that would try to change the way we look at things. It's not an easy thing to do, but The Collapse of Materialism is my attempt to try to change the perspective that we all have in how we experience and view the world.
Now, what you've just described there is actually a big part of what I'm trying to do here as well, which is obviously why we're here today together. Now, in the title of your book, you've got science in there, the word science, you've got God in there, so straight away that's like provocative. Materialism. So perhaps just set out, as we begin this, a little synopsis for folks about what materialism is from a societal and a cultural point of view, and why and how that is beginning to break down.
Well, materialism has really many facets. The materialism that I am attacking is really the scientific materialism, which is the view of the world that ultimate reality is a thing, a piece of matter, that we are really a big machine, and that, like any other machine, if you break it down, you wind up with small pieces of a machine. Now, one very important feature of our current scientific worldview is that if you view the world as a machine, as something apart from our essence, apart from our spirits, separate from our minds, then the world itself has no purpose because things don't have purposes. There's also no way for us to affect the world, to change the world. We are a victim of it. It separates ourselves from each other. It separates us from nature, and it separates us from spirit or God. The breakdown that's occurring here is that this model of science, the attempt of science to explain the world as a big machine, is falling apart, and we're going to have to replace it with something that has a longer duration, that is more deeply rooted. Many of us don't even realize that materialism, this world as a machine, does control our lives. The best example probably being medical science, where medical science, the orthodox view, treats the body as a machine. Something goes wrong, you replace a part, you repair squeaking joints, you attack diseases with chemicals, as if the body is a machine. And so materialism is the notion that we are really just one big conglomeration of inert, lifeless stuff that just happened to assemble itself into life and consciousness. And it's a long story, there's a lot to it, but the most important thing is that this doctrine, materialism, controls the way we think, and in my opinion, it imprisons who we really are, which I think are immortal, unlimited, infinite spirits. It sounds a little, from that perspective, it may sound a little new agey, but the point is that, to me, mind consciousness is front and center, not matter, and I think that's where things are heading. That's why I wrote the book.
Yes, I think this notion of the universe as random, meaningless, an accident devoid of purpose or design, as you say, it has a huge effect on the way we think and therefore on the way we act. And not just on a sort of mundane day-to-day level that affects our individual thinking and, people sort of, why do I bother getting up in the morning, or we're all going to die, it's pointless, which I even see some quite optimistic and relatively happy people in their quieter moments feel a bit burdened by this existential gloom. But when you look at world events, I think this has an enormous effect on all the chaos and the war and the conflict that we see. And this breakdown, as you say, I think it's happening at a very key time. And I know lots of human societies have thought they lived at an important time. But we're at a cusp here, and I don't know, you give me your take on this. I think this is something that really needs to happen, and sooner rather than later, because, we're in a lot of trouble in many fronts at the minute.
Well, I think you're exactly right, Greg, and that's this is sort of a multi-dimensional problem. It has tentacles spanning in every direction, because it affects the conflict with religion, where we all know that there is one God. I mean, that's almost all religions are based upon that notion. But then we have warring camps who take different interpretations of what God really is, where he or she is, who has the greater access to God. That, of course, to me, is also a result of materialism, which we could talk about further. Then, of course, when we separate from the environmental perspective, when we separate ourselves from nature, when we treat nature as some kind of foreign object that came from us, they came at us from the Big Bang, and that we're just a random creation. And, Stephen Hawking says, in a quote I use in my book, that we're just chemical scum on an average planet floating around in space. I mean, this is like the leading scientist in the world who's telling us we're chemical scum. And that causes us, I think, not to treat the world with the respect it's due under any view of the world. And I don't care whether you're a hardcore materialist or a spiritualist, the world and the universe is a miracle. Because whether it came as an outcome of the creation of a God or whether it came from a Big Bang, it's a miracle. My opinion is that if we really look at it and get down to the bottom of it, it really is a projection from us, from God, And it is a miracle that we should be spending the rest of the time appreciating. When you get to that mindset, I think, you reach a truth that is extremely deep and I think connects us with nature and makes us appreciate it more. It's like a gift that you finally realize is true and real. And to me, Greg, the secret or the key here is integrating that principle into the way we think, into science, into religion. And I'm with you. Things have to move in this direction, but to me, it's we have to absorb it as if like we've absorbed the law of gravity. It has to be real to us.
You're using the word God there freely, and that's absolutely fine. We have to try and put a name on something that's ineffable, really. But
right.
When you're speaking and presenting your work, what sort of different reactions do you get to that? Because for a lot of people, they hear the word God and they switch off.
Yeah, no, that's true, and I think that's really a reaction that a lot of people have towards orthodox views of God. What I use the term synonymous with spirit or oneness or unity or source. I agree that sometimes it carries connotations. I mean, not the same connotations as Jesus Christ would carry, but I mean the classic unity of spirit, the power within. There's a book by Aldous Huxley called The Perennial Philosophy, where it's really a great study of how the notion of a divine source is so fundamental to civilization. That's really what I mean. I mean this unifying source. I think the whole topic of how we came to sort of color that concept of God with all these preconceptions is a whole nother interesting discussion. And frankly, I think it has something to do with the reaction against creationism, and the lack of credibility creationism has in the scientific community that causes a lot of the problems. But I don't think words or titles are necessary. My best description would probably be the one mind, source, spirit. It doesn't really matter. I don't want to. I think the key thing here is to break down our preconceptions to ground level and build it up. I don't want to come to the discussion with these preconceived ideas.
Yeah, and when you start to talk about the idea of maybe purpose in creation or design, which to me seems evident in nature everywhere you look,
right.
That then, what two words do we draw out from that? We get intelligent design. And a bit like creationism, then people are, oh, here we go, intelligent design. Whereas, so
right.
Those words have kind of become tainted as well.
Yes. I think you're right. And it's not a good thing. And I think and let me explain why. We are really in a society, at least in this country, where we love a good fight. We love the Smith versus the Joneses, the us versus the thems, Republicans versus Democrats, black versus white. We love the dichotomy. And so we set up this dichotomy, science versus creationism, as if one is completely right and the other is completely wrong. I think it's more healthy to sort of look at both and figure out, do any of them have something good to say, or can any of them be right? And put differently, I don't think the solution to the universe is a multiple choice exam where you only have two choices. I think we need to rise above these preconceptions, this terminology, the semantics, and figure out if there's another way to understand things. I mean, I think the problem with creationism for me is that it sort of stops the analysis at the Bible. That's one criticism of it. It's sort of like saying, yeah, I'm a creationist. Everything that the world came from God because it says it in the Bible. See, to me, that stops the thought process. So that is not a positive way to look at things. Science says, though, we think that the world came from a Big Bang and we're a random creation. Why? Well, because our leading scientists say so. It's not a lot different. they're both relying upon different levels of authority. The advantage science has is that it's supposed to be a self-correcting, questioning inquiry as opposed to proclamations or revelations. So we need to have this debate. That's really what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get people at least talking about these topics and not be intimidated because we've been brought up with ideas of what science or religion are. We need to break through those preconceptions and think for ourselves.
Well, you talk about, science being not revelations, for example, or visions, and yet I think of quite a number of scientists, eminent ones, who are celebrated as leaders in their field, who maybe went into a darkened room to just sit quietly for a while, or suddenly woke up at night with, hey, a revelation, and rushed into their lab, and off they went. And where did that come from?
Yeah, you're exactly right. I have a section of that in my book about how many of the greatest discoveries in science came through visions, dreams. They do say revelations. The only difference is that when the scientist has one of these epiphany or a eureka moment is what they're called as well, then the scientist could go out and test it. That's the only difference. But I do think it is remarkable of how so many scientific discoveries came through that way, Greg, which is this vision. It's just like it's sort of like, to me, it's like the mind latches on to a fundamental secret because that secret is part of itself and it's understanding itself. That's the remarkable part of it. That's, to me, and I have this in my book, why these eureka moments are so profound, because it's as if the mind of humankind is understanding a truth of the one spirit, or the small mind's understanding the one mind, the big mind. And so it really is something, to me, that shows an overlap between science and spirituality. To me that shows, hey, there's not a wall between these disciplines, because science also engages in spiritual quests when they discover truth.
Yeah, well, that's a key point in general there, is that when you look at it, science and spirituality have held different degrees of importance down the ages in societies and globally. And, since the scientific revolution of a few centuries ago, that's dominated the West in particular. But when you look at it, particularly now, this is one of the most interesting things about what's happening, the transformation that's underway, is that physics and metaphysics are quite often trying to describe the same things, but they're just they're almost denying each other. But if you zoom out and look at the big picture, it's kind of like, well, over here they're saying this, and over here they're saying this. Well, yeah, of course, and if you look at what's been revealed in quantum physics, they're describing things. You think, well, hang on, 5,000 years ago they were saying this.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really good point. If you read many of the newest science books, and by new I mean, let's say the last 20 years, science is getting into philosophy before these ultimate issues like why the world was created, how the world was created, what's the purpose of the universe, what is life. These were off limits to science. Science was sort of the study of the machine, an organizer, a cataloger, a mapper. And so many of the new science writers, such as Stephen Hawking, Brian Greene, Max Tegmark, Paul Davies, they are turning into philosophers because they're confronting the fundamental questions. It just happens that when they confront those fundamental questions, they are invariably taking a materialistic slant, which is trying to explain the world as an evolution of dead matter. And that leads to a lot of problems. For example, the multiverse. The multiverse is a way for science to attempt to explain, or to explain away, why the universe is organized for life. Why does life exist? Why do we live in a world where the laws are so finely tuned to allow life to exist? And so the multiverse is really philosophizing. I think one of the remarkable things that I have a big complaint about is that many scientists, and to be specific, Steven Weinberg, in his book Dreams of a Final Theory, and Steven Weinberg, by the way, won a Nobel Prize, so he's no lightweight, and he is a heck of a good writer and smart guy, but he basically disparages philosophy. He thinks it's a waste of time, even though materialism is a philosophy. So I think it's really an internal contradiction that the sciences apply a materialistic metaphysics to their view of the world, thinking that anything else is worthless metaphysics, even though they are engaging in metaphysics when they practice science. So this is something that I don't think it's going to last long, this whole attempt of scientists to distance themselves from philosophizing. But I think what it means is we need to go back and reread some of those classic philosophy books, because we are treading old ground here. We've been through this before, and many of these modern scientists don't understand that materialism itself is a metaphysics, and frankly, an outdated one. So this is a rich topic.
Yeah, and I'm brought to mind here with things like the Higgs boson and dark matter and dark energy and all manner of subatomic particles that are called into play to try and explain what's being observed by science. And of course, a lot of these things are theoretical, and there's no harm in that in science as such, because if you allow a theoretical entity, then maybe that can move you down the line and advance your work. But a lot of it is presented in popular science as established, discovered, hard fact. And if you look at the work that they're doing at CERN, that seems to me an enormous and extremely expensive folly.
Yes.
Really. So I know you've got thoughts on that.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think that the Large Hadron Collider, of course, it is the world's most expensive, advanced technology ever invented. It is an amazing piece of equipment. To think that they are measuring, capturing the fundamental elements to nature, traveling almost at the speed of light, and controlling them and crashing them together and measuring the collisions, and it's unbelievable. But when you think about it, the Large Hadron Collider, to me, is a metaphor for science's wayward search for truth inside a particle. And I think it is very telling that the most popular book on the Higgs boson is called The God Particle, and that was Leon Lederman, who is also a Nobel Prize winner, who wrote the book The God Particle about the Higgs boson, because it was sort of a joking title in a way, but the whole point of it is that science looks for God in a particle. That is the ultimate quest of materialism. So what I was saying before about how science searches for truth in a particle. And it's really, to me, bizarre that even though quantum theory says that particles don't really exist, we are searching for God inside this little speck. And don't get me started on the God particle, because it's such a, I think they've misled the American public and probably the global community on really what they're doing over there, because they really haven't answered any questions at all. But they awarded a Nobel Prize to the person who discovered the Higgs boson. The point being that it doesn't answer the question of why the particles have the masses they do. And number two, it ignores the fact, as I said, that quantum theory says particles don't really exist. To me, Greg, it's sort of like a kangaroo court, that they built this, and I'm radical on this point, admittedly. They built this $6 billion machine, and they have to show results. I can't help but think that that's a lot of the problem. I could get into what the Higgs boson is. It's a little technical, but the point is that I really think it's a waste of time. And hopefully history will show that it was really sort of one of these mistakes in building this machine, going down the wrong road. It's like they're lost. They go down the wrong road to find truth, and they build a big machine to find truth in a particle when the truth was actually inside of us. After all, just like the Eastern thinkers have always told us.
Well, I wonder what they'll do with it when it's eventually abandoned. Maybe they can turn it into a theme park or something.
Yeah. Well, just think of the maintenance costs. I mean, that machine. You probably, being in Europe, you probably know more of the details. But I understand that just the electrical use is just like a small city. The amount of money it takes just to keep that thing working. It employs like 6,000 physicists. It's an amazing thing. I would like to see it, just like for curiosity, like a museum. But I think that it's one of these things where, the scientific community has sold the world a bill of goods. I mean, on that front, an interesting story, which I'll, summarize quickly, is that in the U.S., they were going to build something like the Large Hadron Collider. It was going to be called the Super Colliding Semiconductor or something. It had a big long title. And they were going to build it in Texas, and they started building it. And what happened, though, is that the scientists couldn't explain clearly to the U.S. Congress what the heck they were doing. The congressmen just weren't convinced it was worth investing any more money in, and which shows the disconnect between the scientific community and the people at large. They could not justify what they were doing. And so the Congress said, well, I'm not convinced I really understand what you're talking about, all the masses and collisions and then the Higgs field. It's not speaking to my constituency who need jobs. And so it really is to me a situation where the scientific community has got detached from what the mainstream public wants to see, which is a better life. I don't know if this is totally apocryphal. It might be partly apocryphal, but certainly a few years ago there were some reports in the media which I heard about secondhand that were saying, even on the BBC, that when they switched on the Hadron Collider, they could produce a black hole that would suck the universe into that sort of stuff. And the reporting was that the basic attitude at CERN was like, "Oh, you think that might happen? Turn it on anyway." Yeah. I remember that. It was unbelievable. They take the risk that we're going to turn the entire, the planet Earth into a black hole. Well, let's just chance it. Yeah. That I remember that. That's those equations for you that they really, sometimes lead you astray. But it's something. This is really what I think is important with the Large Hadron Collider. I would like to see more disclosure and more questioning of the public into what science is spending their money on, and whether we should be investing in machines like that or ways to employ more people, to feed, shelter people. I think that it's a misuse of resources, but one of the things about our society right now is that the scientific community controls the dialogue. The materialist scientists, they control the airwaves. And and I'm not disparaging everything. I think technology is great. And I'm not disparaging, obviously, the scientific method. What I'm saying is this view of the world where truth is inside a particle, we have to get that out of our heads. We have to change our outlook. And this is really, a scientific revolution is really what's needed. And, there are more, as you probably know, there's more and more books, studies going down this direction. From the parapsychologists to the quantum physicists, even Robert Lanza, who won an award for stem cell research, has a book called Biocentrism, where it's similar to my book, where he basically says life is the source, that the universe conforms itself to life, and the next conclusion from that is we need to focus on enhancing life, not exploding particles. So this is going to take a while, and I'm not in the business of predictions. Yogi Berra said, predictions are very difficult, particularly about the future. But I do think this is where things are heading, that we need to break down this perception that the world's a machine.
Well, there's that old gag, isn't there? What do you call a scientist who makes a prediction? Wrong.
Yeah.
But of course, I wouldn't go that far. I mean, simply let's just say that, and this is quoting one of my recent guests, that science is one way of gaining information about reality. It's just not the only one.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think that there's something here, a very important distinction between the method of science and the content of science. Nobody, including me, really would quibble with the scientific method, this method of coming up with a theory, hypothesis, testing it, and then if it proves true, to maybe make it into a theory, continue testing it, this constant reexamination of ideas. It's sort of a common sense thing. There's nothing wrong with the scientific method, but in today's world, we have sort of fuse the scientific method with the content of science, the content being materialism. So when people say, well, science says that the world began with a Big Bang, it really is, there's a scientific theory that the world began with the Big Bang, or from the Higgs boson, there's a theory that there is a Higgs field. It's not a truth. It's not a fact of nature. It's an hypothesis that we have to continue examining. And so this distinction, I think, is very important because I am a scientist at heart. I believe in testing hypotheses. I mean, I practice law, and it's very similar. Expert comes out with an opinion on why an accident happened, and you challenge that opinion by looking at the evidence, by looking at the reasoning, and it could be that they're right, or they have a better opinion than the other expert. It's all about questioning the ideas. And my thing is we need to question the fundamental ideas of science because they're the ones that are driving the ship. And unless we want to be taken into Never Never Land or to a place that we're not selecting, it's to our advantage to question where the driver is going. And so this to me is the scientific method, questioning the ideas that people tell us.
I remember asking a science teacher at school back in the 1980s about the Big Bang because this sort of thing fascinated me. I was so interested in where everything came from and astronomy and just what was up above us. And I could spend all night until I got a very sore neck staring up at the sky. What the difference was between the Big Bang and Let There Be Light. Because I said, well, it seems very similar to me. And he was like, well, one is science and one is religion, dear boy, sort of thing,
Yeah. Well, that's a really good observation that, I think you're better off. I mean, trying to reconcile, the great religious texts with nature, with science, than dividing them, than calling one, frivolity or quackery, and calling the other one, hard and fast truth, because, you put your finger on something that's very, I think, important, which is, the book of Genesis is a heck of a book. I mean, it is really, that book has just bedazzled and mesmerized people, for centuries on what the meaning is. I call the book, the subtitle is Visions of Science, Dreams of God, because I think it's important to incorporate what the religions say about nature. It's important to incorporate that into our picture of the world and not treat the Bible or the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita as some kind of fantasy, but try to figure out how we can reconcile those books with what science is saying. And, I think you're exactly right. Both science and the Bible say essentially the world began with light, began with energy. And the question is where the energy came from. And, science says it burst from the black void out, a billion light years away from us. religion says it came from God. I'm saying it came from the mind, which is God or spirit, but it's an internal explosion as opposed to an external explosion coming at us. The explosion's coming from us. So it's very, very similar. We speak in metaphors. I think the scientific picture with the Big Bang is really a materialistic metaphor of creation as opposed to a spiritual metaphor. So it's a fascinating topic, but Greg, to me, we're better off if we try to reconcile these things as opposed to throwing them out the window, throwing the Bible out the window. There's no truth here. There's no value here. It's better off sitting down and saying, how can somebody have written this book, who wasn't crazy? And I like it as part of human history. So to me, it's much more enriching to do it that way.
Yeah, I never quite understood why. And personally, I was always very befuddled by religion when I was a child. It just seemed pointless, empty rituals, and none of it, it didn't speak to me in any way. I don't think that's uncommon, especially if you're not indoctrinated by religious parents or whatever. You're not encouraged to do that. But I never quite understood later in life why many people, assumed that our ancestors, when you go back thousands of years to the point where it becomes very difficult to discern what was really happening, we just can't see back that far, why all these people were basically crazy, why they were making up stuff about fictional deities and basically running around in total lunacy and putting it all down on paper.
Yeah.
Because yeah. I don't think there's any evidence for that, and yet we're told that people prior to that, perhaps before civilization really became established, that they were in an upward arc of learning and increasing intelligence. Then at some point, with these great civilizations that we can see physical evidence for, oh yeah, they were all in thrall of, fictional deities.
Yeah, well, I think that there's one way to view it, and this is, again, such a rich topic with a lot of different perspectives, is that, and the way I look at it, is that you have people growing up in a natural world that they're trying to understand, and I do think that back in the early civilization, folks were closer to nature. They were closer to spirit. There was more of a connection. If you look at the Aboriginal societies, such as in Australia or the American Indians, there's always this connection. They have their own names for God. It's always associated with nature in some way, or spirit. And so I think that the writers of the Bible, just like the Upanishads, were trying to articulate this spiritual connection. But what's happened, and I think there's a lot of truth there, but what's happened, I think, is that what we do, and what some of the later interpreters did, was then they promote the speaker, such as Moses or Jesus Christ or Muhammad, up as religious figures, and then we start praying to these figures as if they're deities or some kind of special beings, when by doing so we disconnected the spiritual component of religion from itself. We're starting to, we worship statutes and deities instead of engaging in the actual spiritual experience. That particular point I just made, to me, is really a explanation for why in today's world we're seeing so many different spiritual retreats and sort of different ways to experience the divine. That famous saying, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, or whatever that quote is. I mean, that's why I think we're going back to that more direct connection to spirit, instead of engaging in this orthodox sort of worship of the deities. And so obviously I'm also critical of Orthodox religion here, and I think that needs to break down as well. But it all comes down to the same thing. when you view ourselves as part of spirit and you take that as a scientific truth, now you have a unified perspective on things because you've united the spiritual quest with the scientific quest. So that's what the book is about.
It's funny because when you say that we raise up the speaker into religious figures and then we start worshipping them, that happens with science as well.
Yeah,
I've heard people recently. I was reading an article and I mentioned this on a previous show, and one of the pull quotes was the greatest living mind of our time, and they were referring to Stephen Hawking. And because his books are popular, I've heard people in the pub, talking about Stephen Hawking, going, "Oh yeah, and he says this and this is this," and there's nothing wrong with engaging, with that information. But it's when it's uncritical, then it becomes like a scientific priesthood, because we live our lives this way because science says so.
Yeah, you are exactly right. I mean, I completely agree with you, and that is what's going on in our society. And it's always gone on. I mean, when you think about it, we are moving through a sort of a ocean or a environment of opinions, like cushions, like we're going through this culture or social milieu, as the sociologist would say, that is controlled, molded by opinions. And who has the final opinion? It's the scientists. And who's going to question Darwin? To me, he's number one as being the deity figure. Einstein, who is much more humane. Einstein was a humanist, and I have a lot of respect, obviously, for Einstein. And Hawking is another example. I completely agree. I mean, he's got, I said earlier about, he thinks we're chemical scum, and he's the leading scientist in the world. No wonder the world's so screwed up if we have the leading authority figures telling us we're chemical scum. I mean, to me, that is an incredibly significant point. It's like the coach of your team saying, you guys are a bunch of dirt bags. You're never going to amount to anything. I mean, what kind of coach encourages the team to achieve high goals by calling them chemical scum? I mean, maybe I overreact to this, but I have a real problem with our leading scientists sort of being treated as the high authority figures beyond question, particularly when their opinions are so negative.
Well, tying together, what something like Stephen Hawking said, as you say, chemical scum. I mean that, and we've talked about nature earlier on. That has a huge effect on what's happening with the environment at the moment, and a lot of fundamentalist religious people. And I'm thinking mainly of the idea of I can't quote Christian scripture with any authority, but this idea that we're here to have dominion over the earth, and basically everything is for us to exploit. Yeah. That stems from that as well. Whereas the idea that all is one is an ancient idea, and you said towards the top of the hour that this idea that there's one source for everything and that everything's interconnected has been around, as far as we can tell, forever. And that's, perhaps that's part also of the essence of what we're talking about. If you take that into consideration, how everything changes, because then you don't go over to the Middle East and turn it into a glass car park or whatever, because they're part of you.
Right. And I think that to me is is one of the ultimate goals. And that is, we need to break down the divisions between religions on a fundamental level. And, a lot of people say, well, that's very naive. You're never going to convince a Muslim to like a Jew, or you're never going to heal the chasm between the religions. And I don't believe in absolute truths like that, or absolute barriers. I think that this is where the power of science has to come in, and I very well might be wrong in my strategy, but I think that if we have a scientific revolution where people like Robert Lanza, and then there's Amit Goswami and Fred Allen Wolf. If we have this small but growing faction of people who believe that consciousness or mind is fundamental, if we start developing that idea and it becomes a scientific truth, then we wind up, I hope, convincing the religious folks that, you know what, guys, there really is one mind. There really is one God. We really do pray. You really all do pray to the same divine being. And that being is inside of all of us. So put down your weapons. Okay. No, I've skipped a lot of stuff there, but, and it's very idealistic, Greg. But I think that, you know, frankly, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, not just the ideas, but how to convince people, is I really think that it's got to come from within. It's got to come through generational change where people get tired of beating each other up and killing each other, and they start absorbing the truth. They become like the American Indians, the Aboriginal. You know, we start seeing more of a grounding of who we are into the world, and so it rises up within. You know, that old adage in law is the same thing. You know, you want to make an argument. You can't convince somebody that they're right or wrong by just talking to them or yelling at them or arguing with them. What you can do, perhaps, is to plant a seed of an idea so they think of it themselves. You know, and that's really I think that's what has to happen, but I might be wrong on that. I think that's my best perspective on the problem.
Well, I'll turn to the one mind issue again in a minute, because that's really at the bottom of all this. But what you just said reminds me of something I read about conflict resolution and about framing debates. And this particular thing I read concerned pro-choice and anti-abortion people. Right. And this person who was trying to intermediate was saying, we change the question. So, you know, talk to the pro-life people, you know, and say, well, what is it you want? You know, we don't want any babies to be killed. And talk to the pro-choice people, you know, what is it that you want? You know, we don't want any sort of unwanted babies. We don't want any woman to suffer for any reason under those circumstances. And the bottom line was, how do we make sure that every child is wanted? And if you look at it that way, then suddenly they're both doing the same thing, really.
Yeah.
And you can move forward then.
Yeah, that's good. And, you know, it goes to, you know, what you just said goes to this point I made earlier about this dichotomy, that we love to have an us versus them, you know, put people on podiums, opposite sides of the stage and have them argue with each other, when what you just said is an attempt to bring those opposing ideas together in some kind of transcending perspective. And you know, I think that is very, very healthy. And it's like what we're doing here. You know, we're talking about it. We're not arguing hard and fast positions. And I think that is a very productive use of time. And I think that's the way to go. I think it's great. Well,
it helps that, you know, I agree with you on so many things. But on the other hand, I have seen some debates where they've had a scientist and a religious leader, and they have actually engaged in a meaningful way. Now, I have to say, I've watched a number of these things, and quite often it doesn't work out very well. You know, but again, that can change. That just reflects. We see it in our politics as well, don't we? I mean, I just see it here, certainly in the UK, but watching US politics is absolutely extremely painful to me. You know, the whole red and blue thing, and that conflict, that us versus them, that stems again to go back to Darwin. You know, it's the competition thing. You know, somebody has to be right. Not everybody can be right, and also we've got to get ahead. We've got to climb over somebody else.
Yeah. Well, no, I think that's it is painful. It is painful that we have so much division and so much us versus them, and I feel like that sometimes it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the opposing politician says. I mean, they could say 2 + 2 = 4, and there'll be an article in the Wall Street Journal saying how stupid the guy was. You know, I mean, It really is. There's too much of it, and frankly, maybe it could be the price of freedom to go to that. I mean, that's free speech, that's freedom, and it's the world we live in. But I do think that there's too many people looking for a good fight than looking to heal, and that's the way I would put it. And it's too stressful always fighting. I mean, I'm in a profession where I'm usually against somebody, and the successful lawyers, I think, are looking for a way to resolve a case as opposed to looking for a way to pummel the opponent into the dust. But I don't know what we can do about it right now other than hope for better leaders.
Yes. Yeah, quite.
Yeah.
Hopium, as they call it. Just a little aside, which refers back to CERN. One of my most popular recent guests is a guy called Bernardo Kastrup, and he used to work at CERN, and he left basically saying, I can't do this anymore. And he now takes those ideas apart, which has been very, very gratifying. But he makes the point with regard to everything we've been talking about, backing up what you're saying, is that within us all, we have this tremendous yearning for something transcendent, and the guys at CERN have it, the politicians have it, the man in the street has it, religious people have it, that's why they do what they do. Richard Dawkins and hardcore materialists like that, they deny it, but that's what they're still doing it, they're denying it, if you see what I mean. But there's, even Dawkins will say that he's 99% atheist. That's leaving something open there, and maybe when he's staring death in the face, he'll think differently, as quite often happens. But the bottom line is that we all have this yearning, this sort of inner knowledge that there's something else other than what we're being told.
Yes, and I think that is at the root of everybody. It's also at the root of science. I mean, science is really the study of the harmonies of the physical world, the study of the magic of the world. I mean, Dawkins, one of his last books was called The Magic of Reality. I mean, so science could not, one of the great ironies is science could not exist unless we lived in a harmonious world. And to me, one of the breakdowns, or one of the signs that scientific materialism is breaking down, is that science has no explanation for the very harmonies they're studying. That's the problem. The fine-tuning issue, why do we live in a finely tuned universe? That is a killer right now for science. And that, as I mentioned earlier, the multiverse, if that's the only explanation, then they're dead. Because the multiverse basically explains everything by explaining nothing. I mean, it just says, well, there must be an infinity of other universes out there, and we just happen to live in the one that's finely tuned. Now, if somebody is convinced with that explanation, or is happy with that one, then all the more power to you. But I more and more scientists, such as Paul Davies, is saying that is not an explanation. That's more of an excuse or a diversion from the fact that you don't have an explanation. So the point being, Greg, that it's really the harmony, the order, the finely tuned nature of our world that I think sort of is inspiring both to the spiritualists, the religionists, and to the scientists. And the scientists need to sort of take a time out and ask themselves, well, can I still be a scientist and believe that there's a mind behind it all? And that is something that many scientists will not do. They need to drain mind intelligence from the theories. But suppose it's true that there is a mind and intelligence behind the world. Isn't it science? Isn't it your duty to investigate that truth and to mold your scientific quest around that truth? So this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to say you could still be logical, rational, and a scientist and have a mind behind the scenes or at the source. Because if it's the truth, then you're ignoring the truth if you simply rule it out without investigating.
What you were just saying is a little bit like when a kid asks parents, but why, and they say just because.
Yeah.
It's about that useful, isn't it? Really. But as we begin to wind things up for today, let's turn to this big idea of like one mind, of everything being within consciousness, of consciousness being the ground of being. And this is, as I say, an ancient idea, but something that you're articulating in your book. So just give me your thoughts on that, how important that is. And also, I'd like you to say a little bit about the dreaming nature of reality and how that ties together.
Okay, well, in the logical, rational context, I think that the notion that we're one mind can be derived logically. And here is the reasoning. To me, hallucinations and dreams and even parapsychology itself shows that the mind is capable of projecting a real seeming world. I mean, we tend to forget the power of hallucinations, and there's a number of great studies and books on hallucinations, and lucid dreaming is another example. I mean, I think it's profound how powerful the mind is and how we are fooled during our dreams at night, during daydreams, and in hallucinations, thinking that this dreamt world is real. And so I think that's a sign that perhaps the entire universe is one big dream, and it's a radical concept until you go back to the Eastern Upanishads and the idealist philosophers. It's not an original thought. It's radical. But if you follow this down to its logical conclusion, if our individual minds are capable of hallucinating or conjuring up a real seeming world from nothing, then isn't it possible that the united mind can create the public world? And this leads to the conclusion of, well, why do we all see the same sky? Do we see the same sky because one Big Bang exploded above us and sprayed these planets above us? Or do we see the same sky because we have the same mind and are participating in the same dream? Okay, and I think this is the dream of God. And this is my subtitle, Visions of Science, Dreams of God. That's what it's about. So I think that the mystical concept of one mind can be proven logically, and that is the thinking. The great thing about this way of looking at the world is that it explains quantum theory, because quantum theory shows that at the root of reality are not particles, but waves and bits of nothing, energy packets, exactly what you would expect in an illusory world. It explains the fine-tuning. It explains consciousness, obviously, because consciousness is fundamental. It explains everything. It's just that we're not comfortable with the idea. It's like we got to understand it. And then moving one step further, why does the world seem real to us? Well, it seems real because we're part of it. We are on the same level. There's a passage in Siddhartha, Hermann Hesse's book, where Siddhartha is asked by a friend of his, well, Siddhartha, if the world's an illusion, then why do you care about all this stuff? And Siddhartha says, well, if the world's an illusion, then so am I, and everything is real to me. And that's really, I think that's where things are heading, but we need to sort of grow into it. So that's really a maybe a deep, radical way of looking at things, but to me, the one mind can be proven scientifically. And there's all sorts of other studies. Look at Dean Radin, the parapsychologist who's done studies on group hypnosis or clairvoyance, and how when you combine people who have teamwork and team spirit, things change better. I mean, there's so many different examples of proving how united thinking, united movement changes things, that it's, to me, it suggests that this is the way to go. So that's the short explanation for that.
Well, I read somewhere life's a dream, and when you die, you're just waking up, and I've always liked that. So.
Yeah. That's good. Yeah. Well, it's funny that we that famous song everyone sings. Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. I mean, we say it all the time. It's remarkable that the poets, the songwriters, are sort of ahead of the curve. If you look at lyrics for so many songs and so many poems, they're about dreams. It's unbelievable, and we just sort of like it's in the background, but the poets and the visionaries are sort of latching on to this deep truth, but they're putting it in poetry instead of hardcore logical argument, so that I think is another really fascinating perspective. At the end of the day, I'm saying let's try looking at things in a different way. Maybe you like the old way better, fine, but let's at least keep an open mind and see if we could explain more. Let's withhold judgment, look at the evidence, and see if we could explain more from this other perspective. And if this other perspective happens to be wildly optimistic and wildly positive, we should at least give it a little thought. In other words, if we are really divine, immortal creatures imprisoned by this wrong-headed belief that we're machines, then it's good for us to wipe that thought out of our heads and become who we can be instead of who people tell us we must be. So, I'm too far gone to change my perspective at this point in time. But I think that to me is where it's about. It's about personal transformation, personal fulfillment of our potential by changing our perspective.
Just in conclusion, Philip, what do you see as some of the hopes and challenges for the future, or maybe to be more positive, what encourages you along the lines of what we've been talking about?
Well, I think that the gradual trending towards people thinking for themselves, people questioning authority, having a more direct connection with nature, with spirit. I think all that's good. I think at the end of the day, the most important positive thing is the thing called children. Generational change, bringing fresh, pure minds into the world who are not burdened by historical preconceptions, beliefs. It's sort of like it's like a stream that's cleansing itself. We're sort of flowing along, and we keep replenishing this stream with clean water, with clean ideas. And I think we have an evolution of consciousness going on here, and maturation, where we eventually realize who we are. And to me, it's a natural process, but once you become aware of it, then it's our duty to try to accelerate the curve or the movement so we could be around when it happens. So I am mostly encouraged by young people. I think that there's a truth, I think it was Wigner who said that science progresses funeral by funeral, where sometimes you just have to wait for the next generation to come before things really change. So I have hope in the fresh, open minds of the young folks. If it's not the next generation, it will be the one following. If not that, the one following, and we're going to go through this cycle until we get to that point to understand who we are. Because it's either that, Greg, or we're really machines, and we're going to be at eternal war with each other. So I think this is where the hope is. The hope is in unifying the physical world as we're unified in spirit. So.
Well, you and I may not live to find out, but anyway, today we've been talking about your book, The Collapse of Materialism, Visions of Science, Dreams of God. That's widely available. Tell folks about that. Also, if you've got a website, I know you do a podcast also, so just that and anything else you'd like to share.
Sure. Okay, so my book, The Collapse of Materialism, the best way to find that is on Amazon. And I do have a radio show, as Greg mentioned. It's called Conversations Beyond Science and Religion, where I talk to people in science, religion, and elsewhere about ideas like this, but also the full range of topics in science and spirituality, trying to move beyond the mundane into some big ideas. I also the website is the Collapse of Materialism.com, where I blog and have some other materials. So this is all about trying to change our perspective, and that's what I'm about in website, book, radio show. So thank you for that.
Wonderful. Well, Philip, thank you so much for joining us once again on legalizefreedom.com.
Well, thanks a lot, Greg. It's been great talking to you.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, check out the website, which is legalizefreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programs offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including politics and economics, energy and environment, culture, spirituality, history, and the nature of reality. You can also browse and buy a range of publications from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Based on current audience numbers, if everyone who tuned in donated just 5 pence per show, that's about 8 cents US, this could become a full-time, fully funded operation, offering more and more often. During October 2014, over 50,000 of you streamed or downloaded at least one show. Total donations were £7 UK, which currently converts to about $11 US. Whether you listen, donate, or do both, I greatly appreciate your support. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.